Hello, and in this chapter we're going to take a look at what is known as a pure monopoly. And a pure monopoly is when you have one firm that is controlling a market. So we're going to go through what is a pure monopoly, why are there barriers to entry, how does demand work, output and price determination, economic effects of a monopoly, price discrimination, and finally, what is a regulated monopoly? So a pure monopoly is any time you have a single seller or a sole producer. So if you have one electric company you can buy power from, that's a pure monopoly. And there's no close substitutes. It's a unique product. You can't replace it with anything else. The seller has control over the price, therefore they're a price maker. Since they're the only game in town, they can price a product at whatever they want it to be. And there are strong barriers to entry, or you may not be even able to enter depending on what sort of a market or situation is going on. As for non-price competition, it's generally mostly PR, why the monopoly is a good thing, or to try to maintain their monopoly. But they can engage in advertising to increase demand, but usually you don't really need to because it is the only game in town. So utility companies, the gas company, the electric company, cable television could be a monopoly if you have one, or it's an oligopoly if you have a few. Near monopolies, Intel or Android or things like that. Intel chips are in the majority of computers. It's not a perfect monopoly, but they are by far the market leader. Android phones are the most popular phones. Professional sports teams are monopolies. There's one league, and they get exemptions from the government to be that way. So Major League Baseball or the NBA or the NFL, those are all examples of monopolies. There are other football leagues and other baseball leagues, but not in the major league category. So what are barriers to entry? Well, number one, it could be economies of scale where you get a natural monopoly. Lowest unit cost and lowest price for consumers depend on the existence of a small number of large firms or one very large one. That's what's known as economies of scale. And you can run into situations where this really large firm is the most efficient, and because of that, new firms aren't going to be able to afford to start up. Google and Amazon both enjoy economies of scale, and public utilities are often natural monopolies because they have economies of scale on the extreme, where one firm can satisfy all of the demand. And they also generally get the rights to operate from some sort of a government. Network effects apply when the value of a product increases as more people use it. Social media companies are fairly monopolistic for this reason. What's the value of Facebook or Snapchat or TikTok? It's that millions of people use them and you can communicate with them and share things to them. A social media company wouldn't be very good if there were 10,000 of them and the one you're using only has 5 people using it. So as a consequence, large monopolistic type companies exist in spaces like this. There can be legal barriers such as patents or licenses. I invent a new pharmaceutical medication and I patent it. I have a monopoly over that medication as long as my patent exists. Or if there's licenses at play and I'm the only one who can license some sort of invention or likeness, I get a monopoly there. Ownership or control of essential resources. If you're the only person who owns a resource that is needed, you have a monopoly there. And also pricing and other barriers. As for that, these are all ways we can wind up in a situation with a monopoly. So selective price cutting and advertising. You can stop distributors from carrying competing brands or manipulate your prices or anything like that. And that can promote a monopoly as well. Now, this last one here, price controls and barriers, they're often illegal. And if you read the liner notes, there are a bunch of examples of them. And you can get in trouble or regulated by the government if you do things like this. So a natural monopoly is when you have economies of scale. So a declining long-run average total cost curve over a wide range of output quantities indicates excessive economies of scale, meaning as quantity goes up, cost is going down. A single monopoly can produce 200 at a lower cost than two firms with a combined output of 200. So that's economies of scale. Depending on what kind of a product it is, a lot of times it might be cheaper for one firm to make a ton of it than for a bunch of smaller firms to make portions of that overall total. The pure monopolist is the industry. So monopolist demand curve is your market demand curve. And your demand curve is downward sloping. Marginal revenue is less than the price. So we'll take a look in a moment what we mean by this. So if you have a monopoly and we're not being regulated by the government, the curve we're going to look at is going to apply. One slide here. So we're going to flip back right here. So the goal of a monopoly is once again going to be to operate at the point where they make the most profit. So in this case, since they're the only game in town, law of supply and demand still applies. So price is going to go down as quantity goes up. So at a quantity of 5 here, price is 122. Total revenue is simply price times quantity. So we got our marginal revenue, average total cost, which is just simply the average total cost multiplied by the quantity. And we're going to look at our marginal cost as well. And finally, what's our profit? Our profit is just simply going to be our total revenue minus our total cost. And that's going to be this guy right here. Let me get the highlighter, positive 140. And in any other case, we're making less profit. So at any of these other numbers, we're making less profit. So total cost here is 140. So in this case, what are we doing? Well, what we're doing is we've created a situation where if we make 5, we're going to make our maximum profit. We can make more, but our profit's going to go down and eventually we'll get negative. Just because you're a monopoly doesn't mean you can make an unlimited amount of something either. And if we make less than this, our profits will be less or negative. Obviously, if we don't produce anything or produce very little. So in this case, the same logic applies. We're going to produce up until a point where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, which it is, 80 compared to 70. If we increase to 6, it's now 62 compared to 80. So same as before, and at that point, we're going to maximize our profits, $140 here. So price and marginal revenue in a pure monopoly is going to be right here, and we already determined what our proper price is. So a pure monopolist with a downsloping demand curve must set a lower price in order to sell more output. So if they charge $132 rather than $142, they'll sell an extra unit and gain $132, but from this gain you must subtract $30, which reflects the $10 less the monopolist charged for each of the first 3 units. So the marginal revenue of the 4th unit is $102, and that's considerably less than the price of $132. So in this case, if we drop our price, it's reducing what we made on the first few as well. So that's what we're looking at in this graph right here. So in a monopoly with demand and price, marginal revenue is going to be less than the price. The monopolist is the price maker. So marginal revenue is less than the price after the first unit is sold. The price maker is a firm with pricing power. So if you're the only game in town, you can make the price whatever you want. So they set the price in the elastic region of the demand curve, so revenues will be higher and the costs lower. The monopolist avoids setting the price in the inelastic range of demand because doing so would reduce the total revenue and increase cost. And that's what we're going to look at right here. So this graph reflects the demand, marginal revenue, and total revenue for a pure monopoly. So because it must lower price on all units sold in order to increase its sales, an imperfectly competitive firm's marginal revenue curve lies below its demand curve. Elastic and inelastic regions of demand are highlighted in the graph. So in the elastic region, total revenue is increasing and marginal revenue is positive. When total revenue reaches its maximum, marginal revenue is 0, and then it becomes negative. So there's no supply curve for the monopolist. The reason being, there's no relationship between price and quantity supplied because we're the only game in town. We don't have a supply curve. Our supply is a function simply of demand based on our price. So as we look here, where the red curve tops out and this curve goes between positive and negative, that is going to be when total revenue reaches its maximum, and then it starts falling. So how does a monopolist maximize their profits? Well, what they do is the following. So this graph demonstrates profit maximization, by a pure monopolist. Pure monopolist maximizes profits by producing at marginal revenue equals marginal cost output. So in this case, quantity M is equal to 5 units. Then as seen from the demand curve, it'll charge price M is equal to 122. Average total cost will be 94, meaning that your per unit profit is going to be price M minus average cost, or 122 minus 94. And per unit profit is that, and total profit you multiply by 5, or this green rectangle. So this green rectangle are the difference between our price and our cost. Our price is 122, our cost is 94. If we multiply it by the 5 units we sold, that's this green rectangle, or our economic profit. And that's just representing graphically what we looked at in the chart a little while ago. So how do we determine all of this? Step 1, determine the profit maximizing output, finding where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Step 2, determine the profit maximizing price by extending a vertical line upward from the output determined in step 1 to the pure monopolist demand curve. Step 3, determine the economic profit by using one of the two methods. Method 1 is you find profit per unit by subtracting the average total cost of the profit maximizing output from the profit maximizing price, then multiply the difference by the output to determine the profit, if any. Or method 2, find total cost by multiplying the average total cost of the profit maximizing output by that output, and find total revenue by multiplying the profit maximizing output to the profit maximizing price. Subtract total cost from total revenue to determine if there's any profit. Once again, a monopoly can lose money as well. It's not a guarantee that there is going to be a profit. So what are misconceptions of monopoly pricing? Number 1, the monopoly will not charge the highest possible price because they wouldn't really be able to sell anything. Just because you have a monopoly doesn't mean the law of supply and demand goes away. So you're not going to charge the highest price because it's going to actually hurt you and not help you. The monopolist is interested in total profit, not per unit profit, because there is no competition. And there's always the possibility that a monopoly can lose. Monopolies can lose money. It's not a guarantee that you are going to make money. Monopolists are not protected from changes in demand or changes in costs. So let's say we have a monopoly over something, and let's say tastes change, and now what we have a monopoly over is no longer popular. If that's the case, we're probably going to lose a lot of money just because we're the only game in town. If no one wants it, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to make anything. And costs can change as well. Just because we're a monopoly doesn't mean we have complete power over our own costs. And if they radically change, we can lose money as well. So in this case, if demand is weak and costs are high, the monopolist may be unable to make a profit. So in this case, PM, or our monopoly price, exceeds average variable cost, or V. The monopolist will minimize losses in the short run by producing at that output. The loss is simply going to be average cost, average total cost, or the red line, minus PM. Minus PM, or A minus PM. That's right here that I'm highlighting. So our average total cost is higher than our price. So we are losing money per unit, but this is the minimum loss we can achieve here. And as a consequence, that's what we're going to do. It's the closest the demand line comes to the average total cost line, and it's going to minimize our loss. At lower prices or higher prices, no matter what we do, we're going to get a larger loss. So in this set of graphs, we're going to look at a pure monopoly relative to pure competition. So in the purely competitive industry, entry and exit of the firms ensures price equals marginal cost at the minimum average total cost output. That's what we looked at in the previous chapter. That's on the left. So PC, or our price, is going to equal marginal cost and your minimum average total cost. And that's equilibrium. And we have productive and allocative efficiency. In the monopoly on the right, your marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve. Monopolist maximizes profit at output QM, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and charges price PM, where they're going to maximize their own profit. But output's lower. QM is below QC. QC is in pure competition, whereas QM is what you get with the monopoly. And price is higher, PM instead of PC. So this is why monopolies are inefficient, because the monopolist is going to act in its own interest and maximize their own profits. And by doing that, they're going to produce less than we would have gotten had there been pure competition and charge more. So the number one argument against monopolies is you're going to get less product at a higher price than in a competitive market. So monopoly leads to what's known as an efficiency loss, and that's that blue shaded triangle measured by points A, B, and C right here. That's what's known as an efficiency loss. And there is a transfer of income from consumers to the monopoly as well. Rectangle PCMBD. I'll switch to red. This part right here, I'll switch to red right here. That is going to be a transfer of income from consumers to the monopoly. So monopolies lead to less efficient outcomes, less products at a higher price, and as a consequence, you wind up in a situation where you have a less efficient outcome than pure competition. So what happens economically? Well, number one, income distribution becomes more unequal than in a competitive situation. Monopoly power transfers income from the consumers to the business owners, redistributing it to the higher income business owners. Now, what are some cost complications here? Well, economies of scale may lead to one or two firms operating. They're experiencing a lower cost than many competitive firms, and they may be the result of spreading large capital over a large number of units of output. That's a natural monopoly, or specializing product development costs and specialized inputs. So some firms have been able to achieve extensive economies of scale due to the ability to produce a single product that many consumers enjoy. So social media networks are one thing. So products that can be produced and downloaded over the internet are another. Network effects, so Snapchat, Facebook, TikTok, all of that. People tend to use the products that everybody else is using. So it complicates things. Once again, on paper, everything works really nice in economics, whereas in practice, not so much. X inefficiency may occur in a monopoly because there is no competitive pressure to produce at the minimum possible costs. Generally, monopolies are naturally inefficient for this reason. Rent-seeking behavior often occurs as monopolies seek to acquire or maintain government-granted privileges at someone else's expense. So monopolies generally don't want to give them up. So if you have a monopoly and let's say people start complaining or trying to criticize you, what do a lot of them do? A lot of them lobby the government. And this is what's known as rent-seeking behavior. Whereas they decide to lobby the government to keep their monopoly in force. And all of that is very inefficient. So rent-seeking behavior is certainly not a good thing. It's a form of economic inefficiency. Technological progress and dynamic efficiency may occur in some industries but not others, and evidence is mixed. Some monopolies have shown little interest in progress. On the other hand, research can lower costs, which help monopolies as much as any other firm. So depending on what the monopoly is, some of them may actually invest in the future in new technologies to bring costs down, and others may not. Others may just simply go, we have a good gig going, we're the only game in town, we don't have to change anything. It all depends on what sort of a monopoly you are looking at and what sort of industry they're in. There's no one-size-fits-all assessment here. So what has the government done with monopolies? Well, about at the turn of the 20th century, they started passing what are known as antitrust laws, and these have since gotten more powerful over the years. And it gives the government the power to break up firms they deem a monopoly that is harmful to society. So they can straight up break up a monopoly. This happened to Standard Oil in the 1900s when they had a monopoly over the oil industry. They can regulate a monopoly, so power companies are monopolies, but they're regulated by governmental agencies, so the government can determine price caps and quantities and everything else, or they can ignore it and let time and markets get rid of a monopoly. That can happen as well. How are these laws enforced? Well, generally it depends on what the monopoly is. Is it actively harming consumers or not? If something's a monopoly for a niche product that very few people need, the government's probably going to be a lot less likely to break it up than if it's a monopoly over something vital that is actively harming consumers. So it all depends. And a lot of times, if enough time goes by, monopolies will take care of themselves. If something is so lucrative that other companies can eventually enter, they will, or the product itself may no longer be popular or in vogue or anything like that. So all three of these situations can happen, all depending on what we're looking at. So global perspective here. Competition from foreign corporations diminishes the market power of firms in the United States. So these are just some examples of large foreign companies. You've probably heard of all of these that compete with U.S. firms in American markets. So international trade and the effects of other companies, that also has an impact on local monopolies as well. That's going to bring us to one of our ultimate points from this chapter. What is price discrimination? And price discrimination is charging different buyers different prices. And different prices aren't based on cost differences. If you are a monopoly, you have pricing power. So you can set your own price, and you can also discriminate in how you price products. So we can find price discrimination in all types of markets except perfect competition. Market segregation means you've identified your different buyers and can separate based on their willingness to pay. And no resale means that a low price buyer is prevented from buying at the low price and reselling to a high price buyer. Otherwise, this would break down. So we're going to look at some examples of this in a minute. Number one, you need monopoly power or close to it. You need a segregated market and no resale. So business travel is a good one here. Next time you book airline tickets, just for the heck of it, look at the difference between coach or regular economy tickets and first or business class. You'll see massive price differences. Business travelers generally don't really have elastic demand. It's quite inelastic. They don't have time to shop around or wait. And also their company is generally paying for their trips. They want comfortable seats and they don't really care about the price. So airlines generally will charge business travelers much higher prices than the rest of the population. Hotels will do the same as well, because they know the business traveler just wants to be able to book, to be able to get nice class seats, and that's it. They're not going to be shopping around. They don't have time to do that. Movie theaters might charge higher prices in the evening than in the afternoon. They may also charge less for children than adults, even though it doesn't cost any different to show a movie to an adult or a child. It doesn't matter who's sitting in the seat. Someone's still sitting in the seat. But it might bring in more people and more revenue to allow a family to afford it, or they may let children come in for free, even though the child's still taking up the same seat. That's price discrimination. Coupons are an example of price discrimination. If you present a coupon, you save money. International trade is an example of price discrimination as well. You may sell to your international customers cheaper than you sell in your own company, in your own country, to get a part of that market. Railroad companies might charge less to certain travelers as well, same as airlines. So these are all forms of price discrimination. Golf courses may charge more to business people or large groups than individuals, or things like this. So if we look here, here's price discrimination with small businesses and students. So the small businesses get a high price because they have an inelastic demand curve, and the students get a lower price because they have a more elastic demand curve. Think of Microsoft Office. Obviously, most schools now give it for free. However, if you buy a computer from Microsoft or Apple and you're a student, you get a pretty large discount. But if a small business buys that same computer, no difference in the specs. They're going to pay full price. So Apple's going to make more money off the small business customers than they would off the students, but they're going to make a profit off both. The reason they would do this is students generally have a more elastic demand curve than a business. A business just wants the computer. They're not going to bother shopping around. They're going to want one they're used to, whereas students with less economic means will probably be more likely to shop around. So the firm's total profit's the sum of both the green rectangles. It exceeds the profit that would have occurred had the monopolist charged the same price to all customers. If they charged the small business price, all of the small businesses would have still bought this product. None of the students would. If they charged the student price, the businesses and the students would have bought them, but they would have made so much less on the businesses than they could have. In both cases, that's a less desired outcome than price discriminating. As for regulated monopolies, in the case of natural monopolies like power companies, the government may just regulate them. They'll come up with a price that's equal to marginal cost. So power companies generally have limits they can charge based on what the government tells them to set rates at. And it's what's known as a fair return price. So you try to set your price equal to your average total cost, but there is a dilemma of regulation as well. The dilemma is the following. Do you choose the socially optimal price where price equals marginal cost, or a fair return price where price equals average total cost? Price equaling marginal cost is most efficient for society but may result in losses for the monopoly, in which case the government would have to pay the monopoly or it would shut down. Price equaling average total cost is not the most efficient for society, but it gives a profit for the firm. So that's your dilemma. Do you let the firm price in a way that they make money, or that they lose money and then you have to pay them to make up for it? And we've seen examples of both in the real world. So in this case, rate regulation, your monopoly price is QM, PM, is where demand and marginal cost intersect. So where demand and marginal cost intersect, is your socially optimal price, but they're going to lose money. Your fair return price is where demand and average total cost intersect, where they will make a profit. They'll allow the monopolist to break even, but will not fully correct the underallocation of resources. And then the monopoly price, if the monopoly was not being regulated, would be PM, where they're making a large profit. So there's no right or wrong answer here, and we've seen examples in the real world of all of these scenarios with regulating monopolies. So the pandemic, and this is something I've talked about extensively if you've ever taken macro with me, the pandemic showed a lack of capacity in the monopoly computer chip industry. Very, very few companies make computer chips. You could argue it's a natural monopoly, and when the pandemic happened and all the shutdowns, we wound up with a huge chip shortage. And pretty much all products now use computer chips, and the economy faced shortages of these products that contain these chips. So as a consequence, we would argue just-in-time delivery measures were to blame, meaning that we weren't stockpiling chips, we were just making them and delivering them as needed. And once people pulled away and factories shut down, the chip supply started drying up, and it had massive implications on the supply chain and all of the stuff we've lived through the last few years. Shortages of products, why used cars became so hard to find because you couldn't get new ones. Why computers were becoming more difficult to buy, and there were delays in the new models of computers and cell phones and all of this. These are all what happened from the pandemic. And now you see more companies are building new factories, and all of this is starting to come online. But as a consequence, monopolies are generally ill-suited to deal with shocks, and you can wind up in situations like this. So it's going to take us to the end of the chapter pertaining to monopolies.